CITYHULLCITY. That's all we need.
Hello and welcome to another edition of The Decades, the flashback series that we've been doing on the Tigers Down Under, where we look back at Hull City through the 2010s. With me, I have two guests. We originally advertised just Brad, but we've also got Logan with us. But I'll say welcome to Brad first.
Hi, gents.
G'day. And also welcome to Logan.
Alex, Brad, how are you both?
Very good, very good. Look, it's been a very fun series to do these. So I thought over the international break, we would get into another episode of the 2010s just to sort of keep us going with no football for the weekend coming up. And we're up to the fifth episode, which is the start of the 2012-13 season, which is, of course, when Steve Bruce joined us as our new manager. So we'll get started on that one with a little bit of context on how the season began. And I guess it's probably even before Bruce joins, and there's a bit to talk about with the Nick Barmby sacking. And my memory of that, and I'll get each of your thoughts on this as well, but my memory of that was it was sort of the first negative or sort of murmurings of issues with the Allams as owners, because up until that point, they'd been fantastic. They brought in McLean for £1 million and things like that, where they'd been splashing money around, and everyone thought, how good's this? We're on an upward trend. And then there was the Barmby comments about no money being available in January and all of that. And then before we knew it, he was sacked. And as sort of a golden child of the club, it was a bit of a surprising sort of action to be taken by the Allams. And that was probably the first time that we really thought, oh, geez, what's going on here? What are they trying to do with the managerial position? But Brad, I guess from your point of view, how did you view the sacking of Barmby? I guess in hindsight, it all sort of worked out in the end. But at the time, how did it make you feel?
Oh, look, I think like most people, when you look back at who and where and how, you sort of felt, how could you let someone like that go, who meant everything at that point in time. But interestingly enough, although again, I don't want to sort of draw back that now we know more than we actually do, but it's interesting that the whole issue with the owners has always sort of plagued us since then. But interestingly enough, Bruce did seem to have a budget that came with the job, whereas Barmby was arguing that he didn't have one. So in the space of a few months, there was quite a shift there. But I think most people were probably sort of expected that the loyalty that was shown was going to be obviously what got Barmby through, and he would take it to the promised land and all that. But after he got over that shock, I think Bruce's appointment was something that most of us felt like, oh, okay, this is not who we would expect to have got.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was coming from the Sunderland job. He'd just been sacked there. That was 2 or 3 seasons in a row in the Premier League with them. So a manager of pretty high caliber. I mean, Logan, it is always a bit funny when you've got a rookie manager in charge or a manager without very much experience. They don't get much money to use, and frustrates the fans, frustrates the manager. They leave. Suddenly you bring in a big name manager and suddenly the money's available. It does seem as if it's probably a bit of not necessarily confidence in Barmby's ability to find players. Although I do like, and we'll talk in a bit about players that came in, I do like that the first signing Bruce made was Jukupovic, who was actually meant to have been a Barmby signing. But yeah, what did you make of the Barmby sacking?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that I've learnt about this club and the time that we've supported City is, and I guess it's probably not a cliche to say that the UK as a footballing community are very traditionalist, and when you've got a player like Brad kind of touched on, like Barmby, and how much of a cult figure he was around the club, and the circumstances that he took over, obviously it didn't take much for the fans to get behind him, particularly after his immediate result. So I think that was the hard part with saying bye to Barmby, and why that kind of felt like a dagger to the heart to so many people. But as you mentioned, like if we have a bit of a history lesson and remember why Barmby took over, it was simply because of the disruption with Pearson leaving unexpectedly. So the signal of Bruce coming in, and as you mentioned, being given a little bit more backing by the owners, Bruce certainly came in, and not just with pedigree, but also with a plan, and it was a longer term plan. Whereas I don't think that when Nick Barmby took over as caretaker manager, that was with the view of a long term plan. So perhaps that may justify the Allams thinking at the time. and how it ended up, becoming what it did.
Yeah, and I remember at the time, I think it was Bruce's first press conference, sort of came in and said he was signing a 3-year deal, and the plan was to get to the Premier League in 3 years, which in hindsight now looks, it's quite funny looking back on how long-term they were viewing that. But as you say, it showed that he was coming in with that plan and clearly had that plan in place with the owners to say, we bring in these players, we bet in the squad, get them developing, and sort of progressively take them up through the division into the Premier League. It came a lot quicker than that in the end. But Brad, I guess, positive signing, as I sort of already touched on, positive to bring in Bruce, who was probably almost our highest pedigree manager that I can think of in our history to an extent, because, at least in terms of recent managerial experience. I mean, having just managed in the Premier League, you think of even Phil Brown, who up until that point, and probably still is, considered our greatest ever manager, didn't have that sort of pedigree behind him. So Bruce's appointment was really, I remember when it was announced, just thinking, geez, this is, first of all, this is a manager I've heard of. It's not just some random lower leagues manager that we've plucked from nowhere. This is somebody who players will take a bit of interest in and a bit of notice of, and will actually sign for that manager's name.
No, I agree. And I mean, when you think about, just like you mentioned there about the pedigree, you had Barmby before him, then Pearson. Other than obviously Phil Brown managing us when we were in the Premiership.
Ian Dowie, of course, you can't forget
Ian
him.
Dowie. How could I forget Ian Dowie? From a names perspective, he was the biggest. He's the biggest that we'd seen arrive at the club, and probably at that point in time, probably was the only time you maybe even thought, okay, maybe the owners are on to the right track here, because they're going to bring a guy in who's going to bring all of this Premiership experience, and you would expect over time a back room with him. But as we've seen with different managers, different times, the contacts they've got and who they're able to swing into play pretty quickly, as we'll touch on, obviously the signings, and that just shows that intent. And that's why it's still very interesting that Barney effectively left after having that hissy fit with the owners to some extent, and that was obviously all about budget. That Steve Bruce wouldn't have come cheap. I think at the time they signed him, it wasn't. Do you remember how long the deal it was? It was decent
for Bruce.
Yeah,
I think it was a 3-year deal. Yeah.
Yeah, so you can imagine his wages would have been well above average for a team in the Championship. That's for sure. So maybe that was the sign that the owners were fair dinkum. And I think probably, as we've seen with different managers at different times, and that might be even why Bruce walked into a dream job, because Barnby, we know, is pretty competent. The squad itself was never probably going to do it on its own, but having someone like him come in with his contacts means you're now starting to line up the key position players, and generally nearly everyone I think he would have brought in or had contact with has probably either played Premiership or Championship a lot anyway.
Yeah, no, definitely. And Logan, I guess similar for you. What was your, I guess, sort of first impression of bringing Bruce into the club? As I sort of said before, I mean, big name manager, and as Brad's sort of saying there as well, you bring in the players of a certain pedigree. We saw it almost immediately. I think I remember even before Elmo was linked, I think there was maybe it was Connor Wickham or someone like that. There was those sorts of Premier League players who played for him at Sunderland, where you suddenly think, geez, we actually could be linked to some of these pretty decent players.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And look, that was, as you remember, like we had some experience in the Premier League, but we never really built a core that kind of stayed on. I felt like from the time we got relegated to the time we did a bit of yo-yoing, but it definitely felt like a downward spiral until Bruce took over and, as you said, kind of, touched on, brought in some of those notable players and some like incredible signings, like you said with Elmo. And I remember when he signed Alex Bruce as well, that very, very quickly, that was one that was met with a kind of somewhat negativity from the fans, thinking, oh, here we go, signing his son. But I mean, looking back in hindsight, Alex Bruce was a fantastic signing for City, particularly at a budget cost. So, look, it was great to see Steve Bruce get signed and to see what he did instantly. And what I really enjoyed about him was he built that core of players, and particularly the English and Irish lads that still are very fond about the club now. When you think about Myler and particularly Myler, he's kind of the face that I associate with this, but he's quite outspoken on Twitter and has made no secret to how passionate he still is about the club. And so, it was great to see that Steve Bruce, knew what it took, and his record at getting teams promoted from the Championship is fantastic. And so it was a great signing at the time, and history tells us that it was an exceptional signing for the story of the club.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I guess then we'll talk about a few of the departures from the club first before we look at those signings in particular. But we did, first of all, I think we sort of alluded to in the last episode as well that, of course, we saw Richard Garcia depart the club. Cameron Stewart went out on loan to Burnley as well, which, I guess it's a little bit funny to think of that now that, first of all, Stewart being associated with a club like Burnley, flashy, pacey, young winger going to Burnley doesn't quite seem to click in your mind, but I guess Burnley were a little bit of a different club back then. But I guess that's almost it almost summarizes how that season looked, that we actually didn't lose too many players, and if anything, we just built and strengthened the squad from what it was. Brad, I guess there's not a whole lot to say. I guess Garcia leaving the club was pretty significant. Was an integral part in that first Premier League campaign for us, and then of course returning from, I think he went straight from Hull back to Australia with Melbourne Heart, perhaps, I think. But yeah, he was probably the biggest name departure from the club that summer.
Yeah, and I think I can't remember being overly upset with anyone that had left at the time. I think we probably got carried away with who was coming in, but I think it probably showed you as well that the squad itself probably didn't need to necessarily be of a huge size, but it just needed to get the quality right up. And Garcia probably, I can't actually remember where he went after that. Did he? No, he came to us from Colchester, didn't he?
Yeah, I think I have a feeling he went to. I'll have a look at it. I think he went out to.
I would say Melbourne City if I had to.
Yeah.
Had to guess. But yeah, it definitely was an A-League club, and I remember thinking what a astute signing that was for an A-League club at the time, because Richie Garcia was still, doing a job for us when he was playing.
Yeah.
Would it have been Glory, or did he go to Glory after?
No, that was afters. Yeah, I think you're probably right. It would have been when Melbourne City was called Melbourne Heart.
Yeah, that's it. I'm just having a look at it now. Yeah. So he left us and went to Melbourne Heart. Then went to. I forgot he went to Sydney FC for a bit, but yeah, there you go.
So I think probably looking at who actually went out. Stewart at the time wasn't setting the world on fire, and probably realistically at that time, Garcia was probably not going to hold a regular first 11 spot. So both of those sort of made sense, I suppose. And I remember at the time, I think we had a few of those Premier League potential starlets that had sat around under Phil Brown and never got anywhere, that I believe we would have loaned or transferred a few of those out.
Yeah, I think Cullen and
yes.
Cooper and those sorts of guys, yeah.
Yeah, and that was always interesting, because Cullen was someone that I personally really rated and thought, this guy's going to be a superstar. And then I think we loaned him out to someone and he was okay, but he wasn't a superstar.
He ended up somewhere. I think I'm pretty sure he ended up at Blackpool at some point. That's probably the only club I recall. Maybe it was Luton or something like that. But yeah, no, you're right. Like, I remember seeing him when I went over for the game against Millwall a couple of seasons before this, where I think Robbie Corrin made his debut, and Cooper was Cullen was all over the game, and he was probably our one shining light. And you just memories of those. Cullen, Cooper, Kearney, the 3 Cs, and then Devitt as well as what was pretty decent, and a couple of Featherstone as well. There's a couple around that Premier League squad who looked like they were going to be pretty decent, and then just sort of petered away. Obviously, Cooper's now back in the Premier League, but at the time, sort of went the long way around. Yeah,
no, well, I think that's that. I still remember it. There was a decent clean out of that younger talent, which at the time you didn't think anything of it. They weren't playing, they weren't getting regular games or anything like that. But it was more just maybe a sign of, okay, we're going up. This is where we've got to rebuild the squad.
Yeah, certainly. But I guess, as you said, it was more about the players that came in to the side. And Logan, You sort of touched on already Alex Bruce coming into the side, being signed by his father, and to some extent, quite rightly, being questioned as to whether it was just father signing son or whether he would actually add anything. And he certainly did, and continued to add plenty once we hit the Premier League as well. It's hard to actually put my finger on who was probably the most exciting / successful of our permanent signings. When you look even just at the three pictured there, I mean, Stephen Quinn hit the ground running, as did Sonny Aluko in that season. Unfortunately, that season getting cut short for Aluko with injuries. But both of them really offered a whole lot. And I think Aluko was a free signing, and Quinn was, I think, signed for peanuts really from Sheffield United as well. So, I mean, just looking at the permanent signings, first of all, before we look at the loan signings, but what did you make of these guys?
Yeah, look, the Shawnee Aluko signing was the one that I remember got me the most excited. And I think it's because, we hadn't exactly, with the exception of Matty Fryatt, who was quite prolific, there was always an argument that City was still kind of, not securing any emphatic victories. And I do remember the 4-1 win that we had over Millwall this season being a real kind of line in the sand moment, because I just couldn't remember blowing teams out of the water, like that previously. And I remember when Aluko signed, I just thought this is a player that gives us a lot of confidence and, can almost guarantee goals. And so the excitement that brought me at the time was good. But as you mentioned, I mean, he did score some fantastic goals for the club, and he was a fantastic player to watch. But he was riddled with injuries, and I think that's probably one of the things that stands out when we reflect on his City career. But you're right, Stephen Quinn, he had a hand in some influential goals. The Sheffield United game, he was obviously in the cup, he was obviously pivotal. But yeah, scoring quite early. And I remember that because I hadn't really heard much about him. And I remember just seeing this, tiny ginger sprinting over to celebrate with the Tigers faithful, and just seeing this real confidence and air of joy about playing at City and really enjoying his time there. And as you mentioned, Alex Bruce, when I see him, I know that this is probably an optimistic thing, and I'm not sure that too many City fans will criticise me for this, but I still believe if he didn't get injured in the FA Cup final, we hold on. Yeah. I thought he was exceptional.
And even his header where it hit the crossbar, if that had gone in and we got 3-0, it's a completely different game as well, certainly. So putting Luis Suarez in his pocket as well when we played Liverpool and having some pretty solid games like that as well. Brad, I mean, we already sort of touched on Jakubovic was actually the official first signing for Steve Bruce, and was essentially lined up as a Nick Barmby signing, and he was not really thought of much, and especially after that, I think it was the Sheff Wednesday game where he went down clutching his head, faking it, supposedly injured, sort of got him offside with the supporters, but really worked his way back into the limelight a couple of seasons later in our second Premier League spell and end of the Championship as well. As well as Nick Proschwitz, 2.6 million record signing at the time, signalling our intent and our ambitions, but scoring some reasonably important goals as well, despite not really being a prolific success on the field. And then also Abdullah Faye signing from West Ham as well. So talking about that Millwall game and the Bolton games as well, where Faye and Quinn and everyone else was scoring a bucket load of goals at the time as well. A lot of really important permanent signings that we made that season.
Well, there was, and Faye was actually a big one, knowing that he had done a real job previously at West Ham. And he was also, he was effectively a household name. And then obviously having someone like him come in was, certainly showed pretty good intent. And Logan's point about Alex Bruce couldn't be more accurate. I think we talked previously about it, but I'd love to see Alex Bruce stats of him starting games and what the win-loss ratio was actually like. Because even in that Premier League season, excuse me, he was not just with Suarez, but there was other games as well where he was really good and probably shook the moniker of being dad's little boy, if you like. But the other one, which was interesting, which you just pointed in there, was Quinn. At the time, never heard of him, knew nothing about him. Obviously, Brucey did, because when you look at his impact at the club, although he wasn't a standout, you wouldn't say he was in the best 3 or 4 players over that window that Brucey was there. Geez, he played some good games and was very, especially that FA Cup final. I know we're going further down the track, but for a guy who barely, was the household
he was
name.
almost
He was brilliant.
Yeah, he was almost the most important player in that cup final in the sense that
Yeah.
him playing in that fluid forward role was the reason that we were able to create those chances that led to those first 2 goals because Arsenal just didn't know how to cope with him.
Exactly. He was like some unknown starlet who all of a sudden defenders didn't know how to defend. And yeah, so there was a lot in that. I mean, obviously, I think probably the biggest thing that came with Quinn, and that's probably what Bruce would have seen, is that although he, been around for a while, he clearly had some real adaptability to him. And back then at that age, he was probably a prime age to get between 30 games a season out of. But yeah, the signings he made, I mean, Proschwitz, you could argue for the price. Well, but like you said, he did score some important goals. I wouldn't say he was as prolific as we'd expect him to be. But nearly all of the signings, there was none there that didn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's right. And I think that was sort of the key that season was most, if not all of the signings worked out, which was a big difference from previous seasons where we'd made a few bigger money signings that hadn't really worked out for us either. I thought I might have had some pictures in there of our loan signings, but I'll jump to then again, Logan, on the loan signings that we brought in because they were almost just as important. Elmo, of course, joining. We sort of talked about him. Name on the back of this shirt, which I think is probably a bit of a gamble for myself at that point to have a loanee as the name on the back of my shirt, but certainly worked out, and I think made the record number of consecutive appearances for us, at least in the Premier League, if not ever. I think he didn't quite make it to the overall record. Robbie Brady rejoining on loan in November from Manchester United. I think he signed permanently in January or at the end of the season as well. David Myler, who we've already touched on as well, another really important loan signing from Sunderland. So it was, as you said, there was that Irish core and just sort of bringing in these players from United, from Sunderland, from a couple of different Premier League clubs really gave us that core of players that kicked on and propelled us up to the Premier League.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that is just testament to the Steve Bruce era. I mean, when we look back at this season, and we've done a few of these, highlights, catch-up episodes as we reflect and get nostalgic, it's really hard to understate just how important this season was in the upcoming years and how critical it was for what we built, not just then, but also for the success that we tasted in the Premier League and also the cup runs. Without many of these players, that just doesn't happen. And just thinking back and seeing what Steve Bruce did then beyond adding to this core, this was kind of the beginnings of what was to come. And we talk about Harry Maguire and Robbo being added to the squad, and we know how the rest of those stories go. But these signings at the time, there was no real superstars coming in. This was pure scouting done at its finest. And to have the foresight to go and get players like Robbie Brady and obviously enjoyed their time there because, as you said, they were loan spells that turned into permanent signings, and such as testament to Steve Bruce. But just talking about this season now kind of really brings back the warm and fuzzies because we realize what was to come and just how good things were as they got underway.
Yeah, this certainly felt like the start of a golden era for the club. It was sort of that core group of players that, we sort of touched on, I think, probably in the previous episodes, as the changing of the guard from Garcia leaving the club is pretty much the last of that first 2008 to 2010 Premier League spell, and then leading into this second spell in 2013 through to 2015, and then, secondary sort of spell a couple of years later. But Brad, looking back on that start of the season, we've already talked about a couple of the results, but that 4-1 win over Millwall, where we were up 4-0 at halftime, the 3-1 win over Bolton, who at that point were a recently relegated Premier League club, as well as I think there was the 3-2 win over Leeds, a couple of, might have been a week later as well. It was our first win at Elland Road since 1987. It was from the start of the season, we just kind of got going. I think for the first month, it was a bit of a slow start, pretty low scoring, sort of, sort of typical of the Nigel Pearson days in terms of not being able to score a whole lot of goals. And then we just got to that Bolton game and everything just sort of seemed to click into place. And we started to be a much more free scoring, attacking side, at least until Luko's injury anyway. But it just felt like there was a lot of momentum from the start of that season.
Yeah, and I think probably if you look at all the players who that were brought in, they're all sort of very creative. I mean, even some of the more, I mean, I won't say Alex Bruce, but more so like, your Lucos. Even Faye on the ball was very solid and could pass. So I think probably it may have shown just what you were saying there, that first month where it was probably results-wise wasn't that exciting and obviously dropped a game or two, but into that second month or third month, whatever it was, to then just go bang, bang, bang. And I think that the goals just keep coming, and it wasn't just one prolific goal scorer. But we had set pieces covered. We had guys who could hit the ball. We had guys who could create. We had all sorts of options everywhere, which meant that we probably had to be watched moving forward all over the park, whereas we probably haven't. I mean, even you go back to the Phil Brown era, we relied on Giovanni to score goals from long range. We never really looked like we were going to get in behind defences all the time, but I think that's when it actually started to click, and that's probably where the confidence just ran away with it as well.
Yeah, no, certainly. And Logan, I mean, like you look at that form table in that first half of the season, and there's a lot of green. There's not there's not even many draws. There's only 2 draws in that first, or 3 draws in that first half of the season, which is a pretty incredible stat when you think about it. When you sort of associate the Steve Bruce sides with a bit more dour defensive football, but this was the positive side of Steve Bruce. It was the side that we then saw again in the second Premier League season when you've started to accumulate that strong squad, and he can actually get a side playing quite attacking, strong football. And there were just some remarkable results in that first half of the season.
Yeah, there really was. And I mean, I must admit that before we went to air, I did have a quick browse and look at the results table across the league. And it's amazing how many of the games I actually still remember quite vividly because of the manner that we actually won in. And I was fortunate enough to be there. It was the first season that I experienced, city football in the flesh. And I remember going to the first game was in the beginning of December when it was a 2-0 win over Huddersfield Town. And just finally going there, and it was kind of that Christmas period was very prolific for us. We had a really, really good patch of football, but it was the first time that I think I really genuinely started to feel, we're a very good chance of being promoted here. And as you mentioned, it's because of the platform that was laid, at the beginning of the season and throughout that first half of the year before, booming over the Christmas break. But I remember Steve Bruce in his press conferences was always very, very quick to kind of, pull things down and bring everyone back to earth. And he's when Burnsy would interview him and try and build a bit of hype, I think he's saying was something about let's see how we're going. Let's see where we are when the daffodils come up, and he's referring to next summer. So I do always remember that kind of push pull. Bruce was always trying to downplay things, keep everyone level headed, and we know what ends up happening in the season. But yeah, really impressive, and there was some great football, and as I said, a lot of goals being scored too, which wasn't exactly something that we were always used to.
Yeah, certainly. And I was the same. I was just thinking about this before we went to air, and this is certainly the first season that I have really clear memories of a lot of the games just because of so many positive memories associated with them. And I think for me, the game that I probably think of is the 4-1 against Millwall, where we were 4-0 up at half time. And I thought to score 4 goals and a half is just such an un-City-like thing to do, especially against a Millwall side who are pretty competitive at that point of time as well. Brad, was there a particular result that probably stood out for you, or a particular game that you can remember quite clearly from that first half of the season that really made you think, wow, geez, we could actually get promoted here?
Yeah, look, I think without a doubt the Leeds game is probably the one that stood out the most, mainly because of who we were playing. But it was actually the fact that just the way we strung some games together. So I know it was the Bolton and Millwall games were about a week or two apart, but it was around that time that you just started to maybe believe that, okay, we're not bottom half, we're top half and could really sort of push on. And I think you're right, Bolton was definitely a game, remembering back, although I don't remember much of it, the fact that that's when you started to believe, well, okay, we could actually do this here. And it's not just, you've got a new manager, we'll bring some players in. There started to be a little bit of belief, but probably the biggest game was definitely the Leeds game. To do it away was always the pinnacle, And at those times, Leeds had probably just started to expect that they were going to get back to the top flight before us again. And to probably not labour on it too much, we put a real damper on it, and that's probably the key. But there was just a good run there for a while where we weren't beating with no disrespect, but we weren't beating a Peterborough or even a Barnsley. We were beating, Bolton or Leeds or Millwall, clubs that we really had to beat, that we always struggled to in championship years.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned there we weren't beating a Peterborough or so on, and I'm just looking at the results and remembering that 3-1 loss to Peterborough, and that was actually the night of the AFL Grand Final where I was in Melbourne for the Swans game in 2012, and I remember being out at 2 a.m. or whatever time it would have been when we were playing Peterborough and checking my phone and seeing the result. And I confess I wasn't too fussed about the result at that point in time. My thoughts were with my other sporting team, but that was the sort of result that could have sort of brought us back to earth and potentially derailed a pretty positive start to the season. But and then we lost the following game against Blackpool as well, but then bounced back quite effectively with wins over Sheff Wednesday and Ipswich Town, where I think that was the Ipswich Town game where Proschwitz, I mean, we talked before about Proschwitz not scoring many goals, but scoring important goals, got his brace off the bench in the 74th and 93rd minutes to earn us a pretty remarkable sort of 3 points against Ipswich in that game and to sort of get us back on track after a bit of a sticky patch. But yeah, you're right. I mean, you look at some of those results and who we were playing and beating. And I mean, even that Birmingham game, from memory, that was the game where Aluko just looked absolutely unplayable. And I think it might have actually been around then where he got injured. But for a while there, we were just looking so free scoring and could just take on anyone. And Logan, I mean, I guess looking at that final game of the first half of the season against Leeds, 29th of December, where we were able to finish finish the year, I should say, in second place in the table with, I mean, a lot of City supporters look back on that game as almost the best football we've ever played, in the sense that we've just the most complete the team has looked in the way that we just dismantled Leeds in that game. And Evans and Myler getting on the score sheet in that one, but it was really a statement win as well.
Yeah, absolutely it was. And I remember as well, I was at this game and it was a fantastic game to be at, but we didn't score our goals until the second half. But like you said, we never really looked in trouble that game. I was like, it was always going to be a matter of when. And yeah, it was actually really nice to see, such a comprehensive victory over Leeds, particularly as, Brad already talked about the first game against them and winning 3-2, but then to bring them back to the KC and just, devour them really was such a pivotal moment, I think, and particularly as it was kind of separated by a really rich run of form. I also do have a slight story about the match afterwards, and I was in Edinburgh for New Year's Eve, and did the long journey of driving from Edinburgh across to Blackpool for the New Year's Day 0-0 draw. And I would have to say that that's the longest travel for the most meaningless result in the sport that I've ever had to encounter. So, I just I still to this day wonder whether I made the right decision. And it was great to go to Blackpool and to see Bloomfield Road in all its glory. But for 0-0, it's a long it's a long 10, 11 hour return trip.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, that'd be an interesting one to. It is always a bit of a gamble. I've always thought, I think the following season when I bought my tickets, someone over there to watch City play, and you think to yourself, ooh, I hope I'm not going over and just going to get a 0-0 or watch us get belted or something like that. It's always a bit of a gamble, but look, it all paid off in the end. I guess closing thoughts from yourself, Brad, before we wrap this one up.
Look, obviously, without giving too much away for the second half, it was a really good time to be a supporter. You started to get some belief back. You thought after the Brown era and all the success that we had that couldn't be topped. And you also started to think that the hangover of wage bill and transfer issues around those Premier years were going to be with us for 30 years and we're never going to get back there. So I think that belief started to come back. And probably the interesting one, which I do remember when you just mentioned about Kit, with Elmo's kit for a minute. I remember at the start of the season being really disappointed with that kit, and not that I didn't like it, and how it looked, but it was more the fact that, hey, we've gone away from the stripes again.
Yeah.
And that was me being the traditionalist, things like that. And I was actually reminded by my old man at the time that, do you know the last time we got promoted from the championship, we dropped the stripes for the first time, and in the championship, of course, and went up. So that's when you, just as a little side point, if you like, that's when you start going, oh yeah, you know what it's like. You guys are the same. You get obsessed with these little fine points and say, oh wow, okay. I didn't want to remind him that we obviously wore the well, I call it the Bullard shirt, and that had the really weak stripes on it, and we got relegated. But his point was that when we're in the championship and we got promoted, we dropped the stripes. So I thought, okay,
Maybe that's the omen they're going
A
for
sign.
this season with the
Yeah.
with the stripe. I'd forgotten that actually. That was right. That the years we dropped the stripes, we did all right. Although, in saying that, what was it? The 2020-21 season with the tiger claw marks across the shirt got relegated. But you could.
Yep.
Up until that point,
Yeah.
it had been a pretty good omen when we dropped the stripes. That's right.
Yeah.
And Logan, closing thoughts from yourself?
Yeah, there's one fixture that still bugs me to this day, and it was you will remember it when I bring it up. It was when we played Burnley at the KCOM, and Dean Marnie, the pork chop, scored a goal and celebrated like he just won the World
Yeah.
Cup for England. And I remember that being such a sour point for the City fans, because as far as we were all aware, there was never any ill feelings towards Dean Marnie. And, gone are the days where footballers will, respectfully not celebrate against old clubs. He brought out the biggest celebration in potentially the history of football, right in front of the Tigers faithful. So he has etched a everlasting moment in my brain, and for all the wrong reasons. But
That's right.
yeah, it's
Forgotten all about
interesting, to think about that now.
Yeah,
Well, at least you know, mate. He didn't score in any big games for us anyway, mate. So that's why he had to celebrate.
That's right. But what a reminder to us that always fear the ex-player, right?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Always the way, isn't it? All right. Well, no worries. Like, thank you both for joining me for this one. We'll try and be back probably for the next international break to cover the second half of this season, and it's really the start of a pretty golden era. So it'll be a lot of fun to look back on the next couple of seasons as well over the next few months, I suspect, as we look back on that Bruce era and the Premier League heights that we reached with it. So thanks for joining me, Logan.
No worries, Alex. Good to be here.
No worries. And thanks as well, Brad.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. And thanks everyone for listening in for this special episode of the Tigers Down Under. We'll be back next week to recap on the league action that City's just been in over the past weekend and look ahead to the resumption of our fixtures in the championship as well. So don't miss that one either. But until next time, come on, City.